Chapter 8, 1962. Becky opened the back gate of the cottage and looked out. "Finally, they're home," she said to herself. She left the gate open and walked across the road. 3 of the women from the cottage opposite sat on their veranda playing some kind of board game. As Becky got closer, she could see that it was Scrabble. "Hello," she called. The women waved. "Are you any good at Scrabble?" said one of them. "I'm losing here." Becky laughed. "Actually, do you mind if I come in? I wanted to ask you something." "Of course not, love," replied the woman. Come in, grab a chair." Becky got a chair and brought it to the table. "I'm Shirl," said the woman, "and this is Ruth and Sally." The other women smiled at Becky. She sat down. "I'm Becky," she said. "I'm sorry to interrupt your game, but I wanted to know something, and I thought you might be able to help." The women all looked at her and waited. Suddenly, she didn't know where to start. I went on a tour of Wajamup Lighthouse today, and the guide told me a story about one of the lighthouse keepers, Leslie Newman. He was accused of killing a girl about 45 years ago. She turned to Shirl. "And I remember you said the other day that you all used to come here when you were children. And I wondered, well, if you remember anything about it." Shirl sat back in her seat. "Leslie Newman," she breathed. "It's a long time since I've heard that name." "So you do remember?" asked Becky. "Oh, yes," replied Shirl. "You couldn't forget. It was in all the newspapers. Quite a scandal. I must have been about 14 years old." "Yes, I was about 10, I think," added Sally. "I was 7, said Ruth. "My mother wouldn't let me go anywhere alone for weeks after that girl was killed," said Shirl. "What happened?" asked Becky. "Oh, well, who knows," said Shirl. "The girl, what was her name? Bessie? Libby?" "Lizzie," said Sally. "Lizzie Keegan," added Ruth. "Lizzie Keegan, that was it," said Shirl. "She was only 16. She was found strangled out at West End." "West End?" repeated Becky. "Oh, like that man the other day," said Sally. "Did you hear about that?" Becky nodded. "But Lizzie Keegan wasn't a criminal," said Shirl. "No," said Ruth. "Anyway," continued Shirl, "it was a big shock for everyone. Rottnest seems quiet and peaceful these days, so imagine what it was like in 1960. 1961, said Ruth. "Yes," said Shirl. "There were no settlements at Geordie and Longreach, no coffee shops, no regular bus service around the island. The bakery was just a small place, 6 people inside, and it was full. Only the original cottages built in the 1920s and 30s were here," said Sally, "and it wasn't difficult to rent a cottage any time you wanted to. The same families met on the island year after year for their holidays. And some of the best families too," added Shirl. "The Parkers, the Scanlons, the Angwins, the Timperleys. Remember?" she said to Ruth and Sally. They nodded. Then she said to Becky, "Of course, they stayed on their boats." The name Timperley was familiar to Becky. There was a Timperley Park near her old school, and she thought the Timperleys owned a newspaper, but she hadn't heard of the other families. "So, It was a big shock, said Becky, trying to get the women back on the subject of Lizzie Keegan. Oh, yes, said Shirl. And do you remember why Leslie Newman was suspected? Oh, he was seen with the girl just before she died, answered Sally. Where? asked Becky. Oh, I can't remember, love. I mean, did lots of people see him, or... One of the Scanlon boys, I think, said Ruth slowly. Yes, one of the Scanlon boys said they saw Newman with Lizzie. Of course he said over and over again that he didn't do it, said Shirl. Do you think he did? asked Becky. I think he did, said Ruth. I certainly thought so then, said Shirl, but then I was young. We all were. The papers certainly made him look guilty. Perhaps he was. Perhaps he wasn't. I suppose a man living alone in a lighthouse is an obvious suspect, said Becky. Shirl looked down at the table. Oh, he wasn't alone, love. He had a wife and a young son. Heavens, what am I supposed to do with these? She showed Becky her Scrabble letters. How can I make a word out of that? Becky read the letters. N, N, P, Y, X, J, H, and laughed. I don't think I can help you. She pushed her chair back and stood up. Well, I'd better let you get back to your game. Thanks for talking to me. Any time, love, said Shirl. Any time. We love a chat. That evening, Dominic and Richard invited the girls to dinner. But we're not cooking, said Dominic over the wall between their two cottages. We'll take you for a pizza. There was a pizza restaurant in the old hotel at the end of their row of cottages. It was bright and noisy, and the pizza was good. They all ate too much. Oh, my stomach, said Dominic as they left the restaurant. I'm going to explode. Not near me, you're not, said Amber, running ahead and laughing. Hey, let's go for a walk along the jetty, said Natalie. OK, said Dominic, and he and Natalie ran to catch up with Amber. Richard and Becky walked slowly behind. It was a still night. The moon shone on the dark water. Did you have any bad dreams last night? asked Richard. Becky shook her head and smiled. No, but I did find out something strange today, she added. We went for a tour of the lighthouse, and on the wall was a list of names of the lighthouse keepers. And there was one from 1960 to 1962 called Leslie Tavis Newman. 1960, said Richard. Did they still have lighthouse keepers then? Wasn't it run by a machine or something? No, said Becky. I read that there was a keeper there until 1990. Oh. Anyway, that's not the point, continued Becky. The point is that Leslie Tavis Newman had the same middle name as the dead man we found, John Tavis Redcliffe. Have you ever heard that name before? Tavis? No, said Richard. It's certainly unusual, but... Becky interrupted. So, I thought I'd find out more about him. Leslie Newman, I mean. And guess what? What, Miss Detective? asked Richard, smiling. Becky told him all about Lizzie Keegan and Newman's suicide and the other things that the women had told her. I mean, she finished, don't you think it's a strange coincidence that these men have the same middle name and that Radcliffe was killed in the same place as the girl? Well, maybe, said Richard, but... Again, Becky cut him off. Look, suppose John Tavis Radcliffe was the son of Leslie Tavis Newman. The women said Newman had a young son. The newspaper said Radcliffe was 51. That would make him quite young in 1962.
Yes, said Richard, but they don't have the same surname.
I know, but perhaps Radcliffe changed his surname.
Why?
I don't know. But suppose the lighthouse keeper, Newman, didn't kill the girl, and suppose that, somehow, Radcliffe knew who did. The real killer could still be alive. He would be old now, but... Richard stopped walking.
So, you think the real killer followed Radcliffe and killed him too?
Becky turned and walked the few steps back to Richard. Or he got someone to do it for him.
Richard laughed. That's a lot of supposing, Becky.
I know, but here's more. Suppose the killer is still on the island. Suppose it's the man with the cap I saw at West End. And suppose he followed me there. Becky! Richard! Called Natalie softly through the dark. Come quick!
Dominic, Natalie and Amber were at the end of the jetty. Becky and Richard ran to join them.
We think we saw a dugong or something, said Amber. A dugong?
Becky looked over the edge into the water.
Where?
Let's just wait and watch, said Dominic. They all stood there in the quiet night, watching the dark water. The sky was full of stars. The air was warm. The water moved in gentle waves around them. There, said Richard softly. He moved close to Becky and pointed. Something moved just below the surface of the water. Something big and dark. They only saw it for a moment, but it looked ancient, like a creature from long ago. It was just a shape, a shadow, and then it was gone. Chapter 9. Buried Treasure. A little later, returning to their cottages, the girls invited the boys in for a coffee. They pulled extra chairs outside and sat on the veranda.
Do you really think it was a dugong? Natalie asked Dominic. It could have just been a seal. It was too big, said Amber. I didn't think dugongs swam this far south, said Natalie.
Yeah, but I've never seen a seal around here either, said Dominic. And it was big.
It was like something from another time, said Becky. Anyway, said Amber, looking from Richard to Becky and back again. What were you two talking about during your little walk together? Nothing, answered Becky. I was just telling him about our tour of the lighthouse. Oh.
Amber looked disappointed. Actually, that's reminded me of something, said Richard. He laughed. I haven't thought about it for years. What? Asked Dominic. Well, when I was little, I used to come to Rottnest a lot with my family, and my brother and I used to play up near the lighthouse. Not Wadgemup, the other one, near Pinky Beach. We used to pretend to be pirates. We built ships in the sandhills and made a really bad pirate flag. The girls laughed.
Did you bury some treasure? Asked Becky.
Oh, yeah, lots, grinned Richard. Mum gave us a biscuit tin. That was our treasure chest.
Richard sat forward, his elbows resting on his knees.
In fact, it's probably still buried there.
Really?
Said Amber. Well, I can't remember bringing it home. I can't remember what happened to it. You know what it's like when you're little. 1 minute, the best game in the world is being a pirate, and the next it's something else. As far as I know, the tin's still buried up there near the lighthouse. Yeah, but it wouldn't be, would it? Said Dominic. Someone would have found it by now. Probably, agreed Richard. Imagine that, said Dominic. You're 7 or 8 years old, and you're playing and digging a hole, and suddenly you find a box full of treasure. You'd be so excited. Yeah, it wouldn't still be there after all these years, said Richard. But as the boys left to go back to their own cottage, Richard pulled Becky aside and whispered, Listen, I know my old treasure chest is probably gone by now, but do you want to go to the lighthouse with me tomorrow and have a look? Becky nodded. The next morning, they set off on their bikes. It was only a short ride to the other end of Thompson Bay, and then up the small hill where the lighthouse stood. Soon they were leaning their bikes against the white tower and looking at the sandhills and the sparkling sea beyond.
Where do we start?
Asked Becky. They were surrounded by sand. The treasure chest could be anywhere. Richard grinned at her. The whole idea was starting to look crazy. I'm sure we buried it over there somewhere. He walked a few steps away from Becky. There used to be a rock sticking out of the sand somewhere around here. We'd always bury it near that so we could find it again. I guess the sand has moved and covered the rock now. He looked back at Becky. She laughed, walked over to him and knelt on the sand. Well, come on, let's have a look. They began to dig. 20 minutes later, they had found nothing. Becky sat back on the sand.
I can't dig any more, she laughed. Even if it is here, we'll never find it. It's hopeless.
Richard sat down next to her. They looked out at the water. Richard said, I've been thinking about all that stuff you told me last night. So have I, said Becky. I suppose Radcliffe's death could be connected to this man Newman, but I know, said Becky. It's all coincidence and guessing. It's stupid. I'm just guessing. It's not stupid, said Richard gently. You sat with a dead man for half an hour. You just want to know why he died. He paused. But maybe you should let the police deal with it, eh? It's only making you upset. You, he looked at her, should be enjoying your holiday.
I know.
Becky threw out her arms and lay back on the sand.
Ow!
She said, pulling her left arm back towards her. What is it? Asked Richard.
Something sharp, said Becky, under the sand.
Richard jumped up to have a look.
It's the rock, he said.
They both began to dig again, pushing the loose, dry sand to one side. Suddenly, Becky's fingers touched something hard.
Here,
she said. Richard swept the sand away with his hand, and there it was, a rusty old biscuit tin.
This is it, he said. I can't believe it's still here, breathed Becky.
Richard pulled the tin out. Come on, he said, let's have a look inside. They went to sit on the sand in the shade of the lighthouse. With a bit of effort, Richard got the lid off. Oh, my old plane, he said,
as soon as he saw the things inside. He took a little toy plane out of the tin. "I used to love this." He put it down on the sand and ran his fingers through the other things in the tin. "Not much of a treasure, is it?" he laughed. There were broken gold and silver chains, brightly coloured glass jewels, lots of brown 1 and 2 cent coins, and some paper money from a children's game. "What's this?" asked Becky, taking out a silver medal. "Oh, that's Pete's," said Richard. "My brother Peter's. He won it in a swimming race." He took the medal from Becky. "He was so proud when he won that. I'll give it to him." He put the medal back in the tin. "Oh," he said, picking up a folded tissue. "I'd forgotten about this. This was our best treasure. I found it. I was sure it was real gold." He unfolded the tissue and showed Becky what was inside. "Actually, it doesn't look too bad," he said. "I don't think it's expensive, but it looks like it is real gold." "It's sweet," said Becky, picking it up. It was a thin gold chain necklace with a small gold heart hanging from it. The shape of a flower was cut into the top of one side of the heart, and there was a very small green jewel at the flower's centre. "Here," said Richard. "Try it on." He took the chain and fastened it around her neck. He turned her to face him. "It looks good on you," he said. "Keep it." Becky looked down at the necklace and smiled. Later that afternoon, as Becky was walking back from the shops, she saw Shirl sitting on the front wall of the opposite cottage, her towel over one shoulder. "Hi," said Becky. "Hello, love," said Shirl. "I'm just waiting for Ruth. We're going for a quick swim at the basin." Ruth appeared at the door. I'm coming," she said, smiling, as she ran down the path. Then, as she got closer to them, the smile suddenly dropped from her face. She stood still and stared at Becky. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Sorry," said Becky. "I said, what do you think you're doing? You come here asking questions, and then, where did you get that?" "What?" asked Becky. "That necklace!" Ruth was shouting now. "Where did you get it?" Becky looked at Shirl. "Ruth?" said Shirl. "What are you talking about?" Ruth was pale and shaking. "You don't know," she said. "You don't know." Shirl took Ruth's arm and guided her up the path. "Come back and sit on the veranda," she said. Becky followed them. Shirl sat Ruth down and went to get her a glass of water. Ruth looked at Becky. She was calmer now. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry. Shirl returned with the water and gave it to Ruth. "Now, what's all this about?" she asked, sitting down next to her. "I'm sorry," said Ruth again. "It's silly. She took a drink of the water. She looked at the glass. "There's something you don't know," she said. "I didn't see any reason to tell you before. It all happened such a long time ago." She looked at Shirl. "You only know me by my married name, but my maiden name was Ruth Keegan. I'm Lizzie Keegan's younger sister." Chapter 10. A Coincidence. "Oh my God!" Shirl slowly sat back in her chair. "That poor girl was your sister?"
Ruth looked at Becky. "That necklace," she said, "is just like one Lizzie had. I remember it because I was with her when she bought it." She looked away. "She loved it. She never took it off. But when they found her body, the necklace wasn't there. I remember my mother screaming about it. She went on and on. I remember thinking, 'It's just a necklace. What about Lizzie?' I didn't come back to Rottnest for a long time. I was frightened of remembering. But then I met all of you girls." She looked at Shirl. "And that made it a good place again. When I did think of Lizzie here, I felt close to her. All my last memories of her are here." She turned to Becky. "Then the other day you came asking questions, and now here you are wearing that necklace. I just got a fright, that's all. For a moment I thought it was Lizzie's. It was silly. It's not an unusual necklace. There are probably thousands of them around. It was just seeing it again here, on Rottnest, after all these years." "Oh, Ruth, I'm so sorry," said Shirl, putting her hand on Ruth's arm. Becky put her hand to her throat to cover the necklace. "I had no idea," she said. "I didn't mean to upset you. I had no idea." "It's all right, dear. I know. It was all a long time ago." Ruth stood up. "Let's go for that swim now, Shirl. I think I need it." Becky followed the two women down to the gate and then watched as they walked arm in arm up the road. She put her hand again to the necklace at her throat. She couldn't believe this. She and her friends find a murdered man who has the same unusual middle name as a man who, in 1962, committed suicide because he was accused of killing a girl. And now she discovers she has been talking to the sister of that girl and wearing a necklace exactly like the dead girl wore. Was this just another coincidence? If so, it was one coincidence too many. She started to cross the road, then stopped, frozen. A new thought had crept in. Was the necklace like the one Lizzie Keegan wore, or could it actually be hers? Becky shook her head. Richard must have put the necklace in his treasure chest more than 30 years after the girl died. It couldn't be the same one, could it? But where did it come from? That night, after dinner, Becky went to sit on the little wall at the front of the cottage, hoping Richard would see her and join her. She didn't have to wait long. She heard the front door of the cottage next door open, and then Richard came out of their gate and walked over to her. "Is this seat taken?" he asked very formally, pointing at the empty space on the wall next to Becky. She smiled and shook her head. "May I?" he asked politely. Becky laughed and rolled her eyes. "Just sit down," she said. Richard sat beside her, and they looked through the tea trees at the fading light on the water. "I love it here," said Becky. Richard looked at her. "Nice necklace you're wearing," he said. Becky smiled. She was hoping he might mention it, that he would introduce it into the conversation. "Oh, yes," she said. "A rather nice young man gave it to me." "Ah, rather nice, is he?" "Yes." Becky laughed and put her hand up to the necklace. "By the way, where did you get it? I mean, can you remember where you found it?" "Yeah," said Richard, thinking. "Yeah,
It was at home. It must have been the day before we were coming to Rottnest, and Mum had given us the biscuit tin. Pete and I were looking for things to fill it.
Oh, so you found it at home? Said Becky lightly.
Yeah, said Richard. I remember. It was in the back of the old wardrobe in the spare room. He laughed. Pete and I used to love that big old wardrobe. It was ancient. It belonged to my grandfather when he was young. We used to climb inside it and shut the doors and frighten ourselves silly in the dark. Anyway, Pete was swinging from the rail that you hang your clothes on, and it suddenly broke. He crashed his head on the side of the wardrobe and went off crying to Mum. And I looked down, and there was the necklace. I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was stuck in the hole where the rail joined the wall. He looked at Becky. I never knew it would end up on such a pretty neck, though.
Becky looked straight ahead at the sea. Your grandfather's old wardrobe. She laughed lightly. You know, I've just realised I don't know your surname.
It's Scanlon, said the boy beside her. Richard Scanlon.
Becky sat very still, but her mind was racing. What was it Ruth had said? One of the Scanlon boys said they saw Newman with Lizzie. Scanlon! Becky's head was ringing with the sound of Ruth's voice. Scanlon was the name of the boy who had accused the lighthouse keeper. Slowly, Becky stood up. I'm a bit cold, she said. I think I'll go inside.
Oh, said Richard, surprised.
Carefully, Becky smiled at him. Good night, she said.
Good night.
Becky went inside, her mind still racing. She put on her pyjamas and lay on her bed looking up at the ceiling. Her thoughts twisted, one around the other. Was Richard's grandfather the witness who said he saw Newman with Lizzie? If so, had he been lying? And if he had been lying, why? Because he was the real murderer? How old would he have been in 1961? He must be about 70 now, so he would have been in his early 20s back then. A strong, young man. Did he kill Lizzie Keegan and point the blame somewhere else? Did Radcliffe find this out, tell Scanlon, and threaten to go to the police or the newspapers or something? But then, why didn't he go to the police? Perhaps he only suspected Scanlon. Maybe he didn't have the proof. But now the old man knew Radcliffe might ruin him. Suddenly Becky thought of Richard, and a sick feeling rose in her stomach. Scanlon knew. Did anyone else know? Did Richard know? Becky turned onto her side, her hand to her mouth. A terrible thought came to her. Did Richard kill Radcliffe to protect his grandfather? Becky thought about the last few days. Amber and Natalie and Dominic didn't want to talk about the body on the rocks. It was only Richard. Richard had taken a special interest. Was he really interested in helping Becky? Or did he only want to find out how much she knew? She reached up and felt the necklace. She quickly sat up, took it off and threw it on the bed. She stared at it for a moment, her thoughts slowing. This was crazy. If Richard was trying to protect his grandfather, or was guilty of anything himself, why would he give her the necklace? And, Becky suddenly remembered with relief, Dominic and Richard didn't arrive on the island until the morning the girls found the body. Radcliffe had been killed the night before. It couldn't have been Richard. Richard didn't do it. Becky lay down again, and before long she was asleep. That night, she dreamed. She was Lizzie Keegan.
Lizzie! Lizzie!
Someone was calling her name. It was dark. Where was she? She was running, trying to get away.
Come on, Lizzie!
The voice was getting closer.
Let's have some fun!
She was on the sand, digging. If she could just dig a big hole, she could get away. But the sand kept sliding back into the hole. The faster she dug, the faster it fell back in.
Lizzie! Lizzie!
She was crying now, crying and digging. She felt hands around her neck. She felt them tighten.
Shh! Lizzie, come on. Shh.
Chapter 11. The Tunnel.
Becky, wake up!
Becky rolled over and looked towards the door. It was Natalie.
You slept in. It's nearly 10 o'clock.
Natalie picked up some clothes from a chair in the corner and threw them onto the bed. Becky rubbed her eyes.
You have to get dressed, said Natalie. We've arranged with Richard and Dominic to ride to Oliver Hill.
Oliver Hill? Asked Becky. She was still lying down and her eyes were closed.
Yeah, said Natalie. You know, there's a big gun on the hill from World War II.
Becky opened one eye.
We're going to see the gun?
Natalie laughed, grabbed Becky's arm and dragged her up.
Come on, she said. It's not just the gun. There are secret tunnels underneath it. If we get there by 11, we can go on a tour of the tunnels.
Becky sat on the edge of the bed.
It's all arranged, said Natalie. Hey, Nat! Called Amber from the veranda. Yeah?
Natalie walked to the door. She turned back to Becky.
We need to leave in 15 minutes, okay? She said,
and then walked out of the room. Wide awake now, Becky slowly dressed. She looked at the necklace lying on the sheets. She tried to stay calm. She needed to go to the police to tell them about Richard's grandfather, but first she wanted to be absolutely sure that she was right. She picked up the necklace and put it on. Riding to Oliver Hill, Richard stayed close to Becky. They would all race down a hill or sometimes stop to look at something, but he would always find his way back to her side. His smile seemed secret and special, just for her. As they joined the tour group to look at the gun and the underground tunnels beneath it, Becky watched Richard. He said something funny to make the crowd laugh. He was so good-looking, so charming. He caught her looking at him and smiled. Their guide, an elderly man called Keith, led them around the large base of the 9-inch gun and then up to the gun itself, explaining how it worked and giving the history of the army on the island. Then they started down a long set of shallow steps which led to the entrance to the underground tunnels. Becky was walking behind Amber and Dominic, and Richard and Natalie were behind her.
Now, said Keith, the tunnels are quite narrow and dark in places, so I hope no one's claustrophobic. I don't like small spaces. I might be a bit claustrophobic, said Amber quietly. Don't worry, I'll look after you, said Dominic. You get seasick and you're claustrophobic? Asked Natalie. I got seasick coming over on the ferry, Amber explained to Dominic. Yeah, it can get a bit rough, he replied. I'm not a good sailor either, not like him. He pointed back at Richard. He sails across here all the time on his grandfather's yacht. Becky glanced quickly back at Richard. Your grandfather has a yacht? She asked lightly. Yeah, he answered. It's a beauty.
said Dominic. They had reached the bottom of the steps. Keith began talking again.
"But you both came on the ferry the other day, didn't you?" whispered Becky.
"No," said Dominic, trying to listen to the guide. "Rich sailed over with his grandfather a few days before I arrived." The group moved forward and entered the first tunnel. Becky's mind was racing again. The guide's voice seemed a long way away. "If any of the soldiers working the gun were hurt, this is the place—" Becky stopped listening altogether. So Richard and his grandfather were both on the island when the murder was committed. Either one of them could have killed Radcliffe, or both. Becky had never felt claustrophobic before, but now the tunnel walls seemed too close, and she couldn't get enough air. The first tunnel ended, and the group could go either right or left. Keith led them down the tunnel to the right. It turned a corner and led into a large room. There was a glass case showing some things used during the war. Becky found herself face to face with a gas mask, its hollow eyes staring at her, its strange round mouth crying out. Richard was beside her. "Imagine wearing that," he said. Becky didn't take her eyes off the gas mask. She needed to go to the police, now. She needed to go back. "Now," said Keith, "if you'll follow me out into the next tunnel, you'll see a uniform hanging on the wall." The group started moving. Becky stayed where she was. "The men couldn't wear their uniforms into the next room we're going to look at," continued Keith. "They had to change into other clothes here. Clothes without buttons or metal of any kind. The smallest spark from the metal could cause an explosion." His voice faded into the distance. Becky was alone. She waited a moment and then walked towards the door. Suddenly, Richard appeared. "What are you doing?" he said. "Nothing," she answered. He smiled, grabbed her hand and dragged her to the other side of the room. He spun her around so that her back was against the wall. He touched her face and moved closer. He smiled. His hand moved down to her neck. Becky wanted to cry out, but she couldn't. She was frozen with fear. He was going to kill her. Suddenly, she pushed his hand down and tried to get away. He grabbed her around the waist and held her. "Come on, Becky! Don't go!" She broke away and ran out of the room. Is this what happened to Lizzie Keegan all those years ago? Richard called after her. She ran down the tunnel, hoping to find her way back to the entrance. She heard footsteps behind her. She kept running. Then the tunnel started going steeply downhill. This was wrong. This wasn't the way to the entrance. Richard's voice was calling in a sharp whisper somewhere behind her. "Becky! Becky!" She couldn't turn back. She kept going down the tunnel, deeper and deeper into the earth. There were a few lights on the low ceiling, but they weren't bright. She was always running into darkness. The tunnel seemed to go on and on. Then suddenly, she came to a room full of machines. She stopped and looked around, but the only escape was the continuing tunnel on the other side. Richard's footsteps were getting closer and louder. Becky ran. The tunnel went downwards again and then became level. And suddenly, Becky could see a door. Did it lead outside? "Please don't be locked," she prayed. "Please let me out." She threw herself at the door, turned the handle, and burst out into the midday sun. For a moment, she was blinded by the light. Her foot struck something metal,
and she fell forward onto the sand. "Are you all right?" asked a man's voice. "Let me help you." Strong arms helped her to her feet. She looked up into the man's face. He was wearing a red and white cap. Richard burst out of the tunnel. "Grandad!" he said. Chapter 12. No Escape. "Richard," said his grandfather, smiling, "you're not chasing this poor girl, are you?" He still held Becky's arms. He may have been old, but he was obviously still strong and fit. His skin was brown from the sun. Richard stood bent over, with his hands on his knees, trying to get his breath. "Why did you run like that, Becky?" he gasped. "I thought you liked me. I didn't mean to—" But Becky wasn't listening. She was looking at the old man. His smile had dropped away, and he was staring at her in horror. Not at her face, but at her neck and the little gold heart on the chain. Instantly, she knew that she was right, that it was he who had killed Lizzie Keegan. "It was you," she breathed. His fingers tightened around her arms, but he smiled broadly. "You'd better introduce us," he said to Richard, not taking his eyes off Becky. "Oh, yeah, sorry," replied Richard. "This is Becky. Becky, this is my grandfather, Charles Scanlon." But the words were hardly out of his mouth before Becky started shouting. "It was you!" she said to the old man. "You did it, all alone the first time. And then what? You got him to help you the second time?" She turned her head to look at Richard. "Is that what happened? The second murder to cover up the first?" Richard stared at her. "Becky, what are you talking about?" Scanlon kept smiling. "Well, you found yourself an interesting one here, Richard," he said, "although she doesn't seem to be talking a lot of sense." His fingers dug into her flesh. "In fact, she seems a little mad." "You're hurting me!" cried Becky. She looked around her. They were standing on an old railway track, surrounded by sand and a group of dead trees, their bare black branches like something out of a bad dream. Where were they? The tunnel had seemed to go deep underground. So where had they come out? Were they at the bottom of Oliver Hill? Was anybody near? Would they hear her if she screamed? Richard moved forward. "Grandad, you're hurting her arms!" Scanlon released her. "Becky, calm down," said Richard. "Why are you shouting?" "Don't pretend you don't know!" Becky cried. "Don't pretend you don't know your grandfather killed Lizzie Keegan!" "What?" said Richard. "My grandfather?" He started to laugh. "What are you talking about?" Becky grabbed the necklace and pulled it from her neck. She held it up in front of his face. "This is hers! It belonged to her!" She searched his face for any sign of understanding. There was none. "Becky, what are you talking about?" he said. "This is crazy!" Then she knew. "No, I was wrong, Richard," she said. "It wasn't you." She turned and pointed at Scanlon. "It was only him. He did it all." "She is crazy," said Scanlon. "Come on, Richard. Let's get out of here." "Richard, it was him!" Becky cried. "Do you remember the other night when I told you what those women told me about Lizzie Keegan's death?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Well, I didn't say who the chief witness was. who it was who pointed the finger at Newman. One of the women, Ruth, remembered quite clearly. It was one of the Scanlon boys, she said. She spun around to look at the old man. How old were you, Mr. Scanlon? How old were you in 1961? Again, she didn't wait for an answer. She swung back to Richard. And do you know why Ruth remembered it so well? Lizzie Keegan was her sister. This is ridiculous, exploded Scanlon. I don't know who this friend of yours is, Richard, but I'm not going to stand here and listen to this rubbish any longer. He's the man in the cap, Richard, Becky cried. The man who was following me. Following you? Said Scanlon scornfully. Don't be ridiculous, girl. Why would I be following you? So why are you here? Becky shouted. Why were you waiting outside the door to the tunnel? Oh dear, said Scanlon. He spoke slowly, as if he was talking to an unreasonable child. I was waiting for my old friend Keith, who is a tour guide here. We'd arranged to meet to catch up with each other between tours. For a moment, Becky hesitated. Then she recovered. Maybe that's true, she said, but it doesn't change anything. I've had enough of this, Scanlon said. Come on, Richard, he ordered. But before Richard could move, they all heard voices in the tunnel. The tour was coming to an end. Aren't you going to wait for your friend Keith? Said Becky. I'm sure he'd like to hear all about Lizzie Keegan and John Radcliffe. Becky, stop this, said Richard. For God's sake, girl, said Scanlon. Richard looked at him. There was a look in his grandfather's eyes he had never seen before, a look of fear. Becky didn't stop. Her voice got louder and louder as the tour group, one by one, came slowly out of the tunnel. John Radcliffe was Leslie Newman's son, wasn't he? She shouted. Did he always know that you killed her? Or did he only find out recently? Did he threaten to tell everyone that you murdered Lizzie Keegan? Is that why you killed him? Charles? It was Keith. Everyone was out of the tunnel now, standing in little groups. Amber, Natalie and Dominic stared at Becky. Charles? What's going on here? Scanlon threw his arms up in the air and smiled broadly at Keith. I have no idea. It's ridiculous. I was just standing here waiting for you when this girl came running out of the tunnel shouting and screaming. She seems to think I'm someone else. He tapped his head. She's a bit mixed up. I'm not mixed up, cried Becky. I know exactly what I'm saying. You have to believe me. She went over to Keith. Listen, she said. Did you used to come to Rottnest when you were young? Did you ever hear about a girl called Lizzie Keegan in 1961? The girl who was murdered? Asked Keith slowly. Yes, yes! Do you remember who told the police he saw the lighthouse keeper with Lizzie? Well, said Keith, actually, it was Charles, but... Becky didn't let him finish. She held the necklace up for all to see. The girl was wearing a necklace when she died, but it wasn't there when they found her body. The necklace looked like this. Then she turned and walked towards Richard. Except it didn't just look like this necklace. It was this necklace. She stopped shouting. This necklace was buried in a tin for more than 10 years. And before that, it was found in the back of a wardrobe. She pointed at Scanlan. A wardrobe belonging to him. Don't be ridiculous, said Richard. It can't be the same necklace. Ruth Keegan recognised it as soon as she saw it, said Becky. You'd never seen it in the wardrobe before, had you? It was hidden there.
Richard looked at Becky, then at his grandfather. Scanlan tried to laugh.
I don't believe this. You're not going to listen to this crazy girl, are you? Sorry about this, Keith. I don't know who she is or what she's talking about, but I think it might be best if you take your tour group back up to the top of the tunnels. Richard and I can deal with this.
But nobody moved. Except Richard. Very slowly, he took the necklace from Becky and walked towards his grandfather. It's not true, is it? He asked quietly.
For God's sake, boy, said Scanlan. I'm your grandfather. She's crazy. She's all mixed up.
But I did find the necklace in your old wardrobe. Where did it come from? Scanlan threw up his hands.
How should I know?
And where were you on Saturday night? Richard continued softly. You said you were going for a drink at the hotel, and later I thought I'd join you. But when I got there, I looked everywhere and couldn't find you. Where did you go? Every pair of eyes in the gathering was on Scanlan.
For a walk,
he said shortly. There was a pause. For a walk to kill Radcliffe? Asked Richard. His grandfather's eyes narrowed. His voice dropped low.
Be careful, boy. Remember your name is Scanlan too. Do you want it dragged through the mud?
He grabbed the necklace.
I've had enough of this, he said,
and turned to go. Richard stared at him for a moment, and then suddenly ran after him. He grabbed his grandfather's arm and tried to get the necklace. The old man struggled with him. He didn't want to let it go. He was strong, but his grandson was stronger. Richard forced his hand open and took the necklace away from him. He held it up to his grandfather's face.
Tell me this isn't Lizzie Keegan's, he shouted. Tell me you didn't do it! Tell me! Tell me!
With the hand that held the necklace, Richard punched at his grandfather's chest.
Tell me! Tell me!
It was a mistake, cried the old man, putting his hands up to try to protect himself. My life was just getting started. I didn't mean to hurt her. It was all a mistake. Richard's hand froze in midair, and his grandfather looked at the ground. The two men stood, defeated, the necklace hanging between them. Chapter 13. Wealth and Influence. 3 days later, Becky and Amber sat on the veranda of the cottage, eating a late breakfast.
I still can't believe you stood up to Scanlan like that, said Amber, and that you thought Richard was trying to kill you. You must have been so frightened.
It all happened so fast, said Becky. She stood up and walked a few steps down the yard to look at the empty cottage next door. They heard Natalie returning.
I've got it,
she called. She came outside holding the morning newspaper.
It's on the front page again, she said, dropping into a chair. And page 4 and page 5. Scanlan's confessed everything. They searched his boat and found Leslie Tavis Newman's diary from the time the girl was killed.
Apparently Scanlon took it from Radcliffe before he killed him. Listen to this." Becky moved to sit down as Natalie read from the newspaper. "It is clear from the diary that Leslie Newman knew the Keegan family," said Detective Troy Jameson late yesterday afternoon. "However, Newman denies having killed the girl." In the diary, Newman also describes his feelings of hopelessness after being accused and says that he feels unable to stand up to a family of wealth and influence like the Scanlons. He is deeply upset by the effect of the scandal on his family. He writes that at the time Charles Scanlon said he had seen him with Lizzie Keegan, Newman had in fact been playing on the beach with his son. He remembers seeing a Keegan girl in the distance, but it wasn't Lizzie. It was her younger sister, Ruth Keegan. Natalie put the paper down. "He saw Ruth," said Becky, puzzled. "Did she mention that she saw him?" asked Natalie. "No," said Becky. She looked at the newspaper. "I'd better go and see her. She'll be upset if she's seen this." Becky read a bit more of the newspaper story and then went over the road to see Ruth. She was down on the beach, Shirl told her, not far from the cottages. Becky went to find her. "The police wanted to see me yesterday," said Ruth, as Becky sat down next to her on the sand. "Have you read the newspaper?" "Yes," said Becky. "Radcliffe was his mother's maiden name," said Ruth, looking out at the sea. Becky nodded. "I suppose she changed her name because of the scandal and the horror of it all." Becky looked at her. "Are you all right, Ruth?" Ruth didn't answer the question. "She never really recovered," she said, "and she never told John Radcliffe about his father's diary. He only found it about a month ago, when his mother died. Apparently, before that, he didn't know it existed. The police got the story from a neighbour." Ruth let out a long breath. "After Radcliffe read the diary, he couldn't stop talking about what he thought he'd discovered. He told anyone who'd listen that he was going to talk to Scanlon and find out the truth. Apparently no one really believed him. They thought he was just an ex-criminal talking big." A man and a boy ran into the water in front of them. "But he did go to see Scanlon," said Becky. "At his house." "Yes," replied Ruth. They watched the man and the boy playing. "The police think John Radcliffe came to Rottnest to find me," she said quietly. "Because in his diary Newman said he saw you that day and thought you could clear his name?" "Yes. The police said Radcliffe told his neighbour that all he needed was to find this woman, Ruth Keegan. She must remember seeing my father that day." "And he told Scanlon," said Becky, nodding, "and Scanlon got scared and followed Radcliffe to Rottnest." The man and the boy sat down at the water's edge. "Scanlon probably couldn't believe his luck when Radcliffe rode out to West End," said Ruth. "It was the perfect opportunity to get rid of him." Becky looked at her. "I wonder why he did ride all the way out there to West End. Radcliffe, I mean." Ruth spoke slowly. "I guess we'll never know. Maybe he wanted to see the place where Lizzie died. That was the start of everything that changed his life so completely. Liz's death, and then his father's." She looked at Becky. "But he shouldn't have come to find me." She looked away again. "And Scanlon didn't need to worry. Newman told the police he had seen me on the beach that day. I remember they asked me again and again about it. But I was only 7 years old.
I was building a wonderful sandcastle. I didn't see anyone.
Becky left Ruth and walked along the beach back to the cottage. Natalie and Amber were still sitting on the veranda. Becky walked through the gate and stood in the yard.
"Did you speak to Ruth?"
asked Natalie.
"Yes," said Becky. "Is she okay?"
"I don't know." Natalie and Amber came to join her. Natalie put her arm around Becky's waist. "Are you okay?" she asked.
"I think so," said Becky.
"Well, it's over now," said Natalie, "and we've still got a few days before we have to go home. So I say, let's forget about Scanlon and Richard and Lizzie Keegan and anybody who's got Tavis in their name," she smiled, "and really enjoy the last few days of our holiday. Just the three of us."
"Yes,"
said Amber, putting her arm around Becky's shoulder.
"And we won't talk to any boys."
Becky and Natalie looked at each other and laughed.
"Come on, let's go for a swim,"
said Natalie. And they jumped on their bikes and rode through the middle of the island, between the shallow salt lakes and the tea trees, past the barrel of the old gun and the lighthouse on the hill, until they reached Salmon Bay. And they spread their towels on the white sand and ran into the cool, clear, green water.